Hi, I'm Leon Charney, and this is the Leon Charney Report. And we have one of the most prominent political figures of this century with us today. We're honored to have Abba Eban. He's been the Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, the UN Ambassador at the beginning of Israel. No one needs an introduction. Abba Eban is probably one of the best writers of the century and probably one of the best orators. So you got 3 out of 3 for this century, and we're going to a new millennium. It's going to be 50 years. And Israel will celebrate its birth, and you were there at the beginning.
I'm very much aware of that, Leon, because there's a sudden beeline for me. The reason is that I have distinguished myself simply by prolonged survival. And people who go around Israel now and look for somebody who was there, present at the creation, unfortunately not many of them. That's because I began when I was 32 years old and became the ambassador to the United Nations and later to Washington as well, and presented my credentials to President Truman. Now, a man who can say when I presented credentials to President Truman sort of dates himself in history, and dates himself also in the special atmosphere of that period.
32 years old. Dramatic vote in November of '47, a partitioning of Israel, big fights and people helping you get those votes. Did you have time to think what Israel would look like 50 years from now, or you were too busy at that point?
I must confess, Leon, that we weren't looking into the future as far as 50 years. Our real position was how to survive the next 50 months, and that was not easy. Here we were assailed by international alienation and by Arab aggression. And therefore the horizons were very, very sharply defined indeed. I read the other day that President Clinton has said that Security Council resolutions are never important. Well, with all respect, that is not the case. It was very important for Israel to win a ceasefire in June 1948, because if we didn't win that ceasefire, and if the ceasefire was not kept, we could have been wiped out of West Jerusalem, having already been dismissed from East Jerusalem. And those were the issues. Hunger and thirst and famine assailed us. And therefore our horizons never extended to speculation about what it's going to be like 50 years from then.
Many people don't understand, or maybe don't know because it's late, it's 50 years later. George Marshall was the Secretary of State, right? And he was basically anti the establishment of Israel. Harry Truman basically defied the State Department and recognized Israel. This haberdasher named Harry Jacobson, how important was he to get Weitzman in there to see Truman at that time?
Eddie Jacobs was very important, and Eddie Jacobson was very important for the reason that Truman had got it into his head that he didn't want to see anybody amongst the Zionist leaders except one, except Weitzman. Some of us thought that this was preposterous. After all, Chaim Weitzman, with all respect for his lineage and his unexampled achievements, was not the head of the movement. And I remember Truman said to me when I pointed this out, delicately, one had to be very delicate with Harry S. Truman, I said, with all respect, Chaim Weitzman is no longer the leader. He says, look, when you get elected to be President of the United States, you'll damn well decide whom you see and whom you don't see. And that's what I took.
Did you have meetings with Truman after he was president? Did you ever see him after that?
Oh, yes, but the most important meetings were the attempt to get him to see even Weitzman, who arrived very disgruntled and very irritable from London, where he was pining away in the fog and the rain and the sleet. Had a very bad passage on the SS America, I think. And he said, why have you dragged me all the damn way here? And I pointed out that Truman would not see anybody else. And even to see Weitzman, we had to go through a charade. We had to persuade Truman that Chaim Weitzman, in Jewish history, was the exact equivalent of Andrew Jackson in American history. And this is what Jacobson said to me. And then he asked what should he do about this extraordinary metaphor. So I said, my opinion as a student of American history is that no two people have ever walked on the surface of the earth with fewer common attributes than Chaim Weizmann and Andrew Jackson. But if that's needed in order to get this meeting, then you should tell President Truman that if anyone were to see Andrew Jackson and Chaim Weizmann together, they would not be able to tell them apart.
When you saw Truman after the presidency, was that very exciting to him, the fact that he helped found Israel? Was it very meaningful to him?
Oh, yes, he was very moved by this fact. We had a meeting in Washington, which was a kind of celebration. He had already decided not to run again. And I made a speech then, and I said that Israel has no orders of chivalry, we have no honors, we don't pin things on our front shirts. Only one thing Israel can confer: immortality. And when I said that, there was Truman sort of weeping into his handkerchief.
Why was Marshall so against, was it oil?
Marshall had the belief, shared, I must tell you, Leon, by nearly all the military experts of the time, that just Israel couldn't make it. We'd get wiped out. And just when we were about to be wiped out, the United States would be forced into the combat. In other words, there was a total skepticism about the capacity of Israel to survive what seemed to be this very impressive Arab assault from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Syria, from everywhere. And Marshall had the fear that the United States would be brought into the conflict in order to help the Israelis abandon the ship and not being thrown into the sea, but to prevent Israel from being thrown into the sea. Marshall, with his skepticism, thought that our only chance was to avoid proclaiming our independence. And I remember that he said to Clark Clifford, who was a decisive figure in those days, he said to Clark Clifford, look, how can, 650,000 Jews withstand X 100 million Arabs? It just can't happen.
How did you get, you were born in Africa, South Africa, or Great Britain?
Yeah. I was born in South Africa. At the age of 7 months, I decided to leave.
That's pretty early.
I had a look at the racial situation there. And then I was brought up in England, and I became a don at Cambridge University.
And you were brought up Zionistic?
Yes, my grandfather used to kidnap me. That's the only word I can use. Every weekend, and the weekend in England is from Friday to Monday morning, and plunge me into Hebrew. He never explained to me what he wanted me to do with that great mass of learning. I know that he was fundamentally and ferociously hostile to the idea of being a rabbi. I think he thought of it rather as the British used to think of Latin and Greek. They were the accoutrements of a gentleman. But at any rate, he filled me with this Hebrew law. The result was that I was bilingual from the age of 5.
Was your grandfather an Orthodox Jew?
He was not even Orthodox in the strict sense. I think his attitude to Judaism was that of a man who admired it for its humanism, for its rationality, for certain rather secular values, but whose devotion to the language of the Bible was an intense, bursting in his bones.
Did you spend some time with Chaim Weizmann before the State of Israel?
Yes, sometime in 1937. I was then lecturing at Cambridge University, which is quite a pleasant occupation. And I get a message from the Zionist headquarters, the effect of which is this. The political secretary, who was then Arthur Lurie, later the ambassador to Britain. No, Arthur Lurie.
Oh, Arthur
Lurie. He was a diplomat.
Right.
He had to go to America for personal reasons, and therefore would I fill in. And therefore, for 5 or 6 months, I worked in the room next to Chaim Weizmann and was astounded by his extraordinary stature and prestige. It was simply not done in the British sense to refuse to see Weizmann. In other words, he had created the illusion that he was the leader already of a very powerful nation on a level of equality with all of the other leaders of nations. I think most of the people who came into contact with him knew that this was not strictly true. But since the British leaders were also people of a romantic bent, there was Lloyd George, who was a Welsh nationalist. There was Balfour, who was basically a Scotsman. And there was Winston Churchill, who was just a maverick, always for whatever other people were against. And they were seized by Weizmann's personality, in addition to which he became very early financially independent because of his contributions in chemical inventions and patents. And therefore, and he was the only man who could produce something called acetone, which was necessary for winning the war. And therefore the British government had made a kind of proclamation: don't annoy Weizmann, at least for the next year and a half. After a year and a half, we'll no longer be dependent on his productions. But for a year and a half, Weizmann was very powerful. This gave him access. It's not true that because of this they offered him the country of Palestine, but it is true that he won the most precious of all accesses. He had access to the seats of power.
Was he a great influence on your going to Israel and becoming a Zionist?
Oh yes, he had a very dramatic influence on me. In order to feed this illusion that he was already the head of a powerful state, he found out how heads of state behave. First of all, they drove around in Rolls Royces, and he was able to do that. Secondly, they had big
He had a Rolls
parties.
Royce
Yes,
at that
of course.
time?
They had parties, and he was in a position, because of his success as a chemist, to indulge all these fantasies. And somehow the British leaders of that day, doing very badly in the war, were captivated by this man and his contagious personality.
I've spoken to Asa Weizmann about it, his nephew, who, as you know, is very close with me. And he said in Russia, I think there were 11 siblings, and all of them had doctorates or something. A very well-educated family, the Weizmanns. And for him to, in a sense, bring you to Israel, it must have been a culture shock for you. I mean, you were teaching at Oxford, all of a sudden to wind up in the desert of Israel, it had to be a culture shock.
Oh, the culture shock was very profound, because when the war ended, like many British officers, I sat on the balcony of the King David and wondered what to do. And I had three options. Harold Lasky, who was then the chairman of the Labour Party, offered me a constituency to run.
Is that right?
Yes, in some place in south of England. Secondly, I could have gone back to Cambridge. It would eventually have risen high up in the academic hierarchy. Thirdly, I was working then for the Foreign Office, and I could, if I wanted, stay there. So here was I, and this had a certain amount of chutzpah. I turned down the Foreign Office, I turned down a constituency, and I turned down a chair in Cambridge, because Weizmann's personality was so powerful that when he said, "You are going to work in the Jewish Agency," you think of a Zionist age of about 28 or something. Well, that was law. And I followed Weizmann into what I believed was going to be a blind alley, because Chertok, Sharet, and all the other Zionist leaders were in jail for rebellion against Britain. And there seemed to be no future in it. It's what I would call a poetic decision. It was not a prosaic decision. But of course, I've never had any reason to regret it.
The first time we met, Ambassador, I came to Israel with Senator Vance Hartke of Indiana. I was his counsel. And we met with Golda Meir, who was sitting over here with Simcha Dinitz. And Vance Hartke had an idea in 1972 that Egypt might be amenable to talking about peace. Golda was very adamant. She stuck her hand down. She says, "We don't need them. We don't want them." She was really tough on it, And Hartke walked out and he said, "There's nothing to talk about with this lady." history shows that Golda Meir at times did not really understand, let's say, world politics very well. Would you agree with that or disagree?
I'm afraid I would agree with that. She was very apprehensive about peace. She knew that peace was desirable, but she also knew the price. And the price in those days seemed to be prohibitive. The price would be giving up the whole of Sinai, together with the oil, together with the airfields, together with everything that Sinai then seemed to represent. Also, she had this characteristic. She did not react favorably to good news. When I came once and I said, you know, Prime Minister, Gromyko at Geneva had said some new things. He said that he at least accepts the Resolution 242, which in comparison with what the Soviet attitude had been was quite a lot of progress. She said, well, what language did he talk? I said, he talked Russian. Do you understand Russian? Well, you must have got the translation wrong. And later when Alon took my job, Alon examined the thing, and it was true that Sadat was making some kind of overture. It's not sufficient to justify
it was the
peace.
Speaker of the Assembly of Egypt who had told Hartke that he would be ready to speak. This was 1972, before the Yom Kippur War, and she was adamant. I'll never forget that. She just didn't want to hear about any peace overtures. And then we came to visit you, and you were more open, but she was the Prime Minister.
That's right.
All right, we're going to cut for a commercial break. We'll come back with one of the most prominent political figures of this century, Abba Eban. Aubrey Eban sometimes. Asa Weitzman sometimes calls him Aubrey, I know that.
That's
and
right.
We'll be right back. We're back. We're talking with Abba Eban, who was the Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, Minister of Education, Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador to Washington. He's had every title, probably one of the most important figures in Israeli history, and Israel is going to settle, let's see, it's going to be 50 years old soon. And as he said before, not many people can still talk about the beginning. Ambassador, one of the people I think that's been very underrated in Israeli history was Pinchas Sapir. Do you agree with me on that? Did he form the infrastructure of the economic foundations of Israel?
Sapir was a very creative man. First of all, he had a very intimate knowledge of Israel. He and his colleague, Levi Eshkol, were people whose fingers were dug into the soil of Israel. They knew about every bit of pipeline, about every bunch of trees, everything. And Sapir really created what is now the technological basis of Israeli life. And that's a tremendous achievement, because here is Israel, until very recently, with a 7% annual increase of GNP. The United States has a very hard time going above 2 or 3%. And even now it's gone down to 4%. But here we are exporting our transistors and our scanners and our very elaborate missiles all over the world. And I hear that we now have a GNP which is more or less at the same rate as Switzerland and Holland and some of these very developed members of the European Union. And if you look deeply into our history, Sapir was the creative force in that achievement.
All right, let's go back a little bit. Maybe you can illuminate me. Ben-Gurion and Weizmann never got along. Michael Barzoa was on my program last week, and he said Ben-Gurion used to send beautiful letters to Weizmann, but in his heart of hearts, he wanted him to disappear someplace. Was it the fact that he was a refined gentleman and a world statesman, or whatever he was, Weizmann versus Ben-Gurion, who sort of was the street fighter? What was it exactly?
It was plain jealousy, I think.
That's what he said,
which is
Barzoa.
a very common
And he said Ben-Gurion was
attribute.
short, so he was always jealous.
There's even one statement in which Ben-Gurion spoke of a meeting with the various British dignitaries, and he said one of those people there was even taller than Weizmann. In other words, Weizmann, of course, was so he's 6 feet and so, rather the same build, I think, that Asa has now. And Ben-Gurion once arrived in London, and he went straight down to Bond Street, and he started buying things like cufflinks and fancy shirts because he was invited to the Weizmanns that evening and he didn't want to cut too modest a figure. So that there was this extraordinary relationship between them. On the one hand, they admired each other, and on the other hand, I think they wished that the other one would just go away. And
could Weizmann have been the Prime Minister of Israel?
No, I don't think he could, because Weizmann's arena was really the world arena, the international arena. He was most distinguished in his one-on-one discussions with people like Churchill and Lloyd George and some of the other leaders in Britain. And later, of course, he absolutely vanquished Truman, which was more unexpected because
and most important.
Yeah, because the difference between Truman and Weizmann in terms of their backgrounds and their cultural baggage were very different people. But a man who could win over not only Ben-Gurion, but also people like Churchill and like Truman, that was a tremendous asset for the Zionist movement. And I'll say this in respect of Ben-Gurion and Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, although they knew that Weizmann was no longer the leader, they did encourage him, not only allow him, they encouraged him to go to the United Nations and to weave his spells there. I don't know how many politicians today would like to have their predecessor sort of kibitzing in and running things for them. But I must say that Silver and Ben-Gurion understood that Weizmann had a certain gravity, a certain specific weight, and that they could use it.
What was the great Zionistic influence on Weizmann?
Weizmann was born of a family of, I think, 11 children. They were not very poor. They used to run
Jewish
logs going down the river. And he suddenly developed this theory. He looked around the world and by a process of analysis, he said, Britain is the country that we really should look out for. And he was stuck in Switzerland, which was a rather boring place to be. And he suddenly found that he could be appointed to a rather modest academic position in Manchester, of all places. He then arrived in Manchester, and he persuaded some of the dignitaries in Manchester, people like Simon Marx and like Israel Zief, that if they would just finance one visit of him to London every week, and that meant £5 sterling, he would create a situation in which Britain, then the most influential country in the world, would adopt the Zionist program. And I think these very hard-headed businessmen thought he was off his mind, a crazy idea, but they did finance his voyages, and that was the result. And by 1917, he had prodigiously and unexpectedly got not only Britain, but the whole of the League of Nations to support the Zionist program.
Explain, I mean, I don't mean to be mundane about it, but Britain was absolutely cruel after the Second World War about you had to have Aliyah Bet and Aliyah Olive. Why was it? Was it the Foreign Policy Office? Was it oil? What was really steamrolling this?
Well, it was my job to try and find out what British policy was.
That's why
it was a very gloomy result. The British argument was as follows. The Jews, they've got to be for us anyway, because the alternative is Hitler. The Arabs, they do have an option. They could be for Hitler or they could be for us, for the West. Therefore, we must appease the cooperative Jews, and we must play along with the uncooperative Arabs. It was a very hard-headed and extremely cynical decision. And it was based on the idea that was, after all, correct. The Jews did not have an alternative. Well, they could go with Hitler.
So you wouldn't say it was really a policy, not anti-Semitism?
Yes, it was a policy. Of course, when a policy is against the Jewish people, then it takes on anti-Semitic language sometimes. No, I think it was a straightforward decision. which lingered on even when Churchill came to power. And the decision was that we have to go with the people who have the option of going with the enemy. And the option of going with the enemy is an Arab option. It is simply not a Jewish option.
In '56, when Ben Gurion engineered with the French and the British to open up the Suez, you had a pretty rough time with the Americans, didn't you, with Dulles and Eisenhower?
Oh yes, Foster Dulles was very, very virulent about it. The trouble with Dulles, it's not that he had enemies, but his friends couldn't stand him. And he was known to be very devious, and he was attached to a very advanced form of Christian fundamentalism. And he kept asking himself questions which mature statesmen don't ask. He didn't keep asking what is the useful thing to do. He kept asking what is the moral thing to do. And that, of course, got him linked up in all kinds of Christian inhibitions, which included a quite considerable ingredient of plain dislike of Jews.
Did he have a great influence on Eisenhower?
Yes, not a decisive influence, because when the war ended, and I tried to make a balance sheet about Eisenhower, and it had a rather surprising sequel. Eisenhower did not join the effort to take Jerusalem away. He did not try to force refugees upon us, and he did not try with any seriousness to curtail our boundaries. So we emerged, as it were, intact, without any reason for gratitude to Ike, but also the major fears of the Zionist leadership had not been carried out.
Wasn't he very moved by the concentration camps when he came in 1945? Didn't that have a great effect on him?
There is a movie, I think I put it on the air, which shows Eisenhower visiting the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And there he is walking amidst all these terrible emaciated corpses, with people just falling down with exhaustion after the terrors of the war, after the tortures to which they had been subjected. And he didn't say a single word, but one could see the emotion on his face. You could see him saying to himself, is it feasible that human beings can do this to other human beings? And I think that's really what, in the long run, inhibited him from following the State Department course, which at that time, unlike now, was an anti-Zionist course.
Pro-Arab. Yeah. Did you find that you've known probably every American president since Truman? Am I correct?
Yes.
Did you find any American president anti-Semitic?
No, I wouldn't say that they would allow themselves to be anti-Semitic. After all, we must remember that when the United Nations was seized of the question, 1947, 1948, we celebrated an enormously dramatic transition. Think of us in 1947, the lowest point in Jewish history. Our homeland is being assailed by international and national violence. And nobody considered that Israel ought to be a state. And there was no movement at the United Nations to admit Israel. The Jewish leaders sat humiliatingly in San Francisco on some kind of lofty balcony miles away, looking down at those 50 members who hadn't moved a finger, most of them, to aid the Allies in the war against Nazism. That was 1947. 1949, our flag is aloft, the gates are open, we are recognized by the major powers, we are members of every conceivable international agency. Now, the spectacular nature of that transition owed something, I think, to the Holocaust. There was a kind of eruption of conscience, even in that very cynical and hard-headed General Assembly. There was, for a very brief moment, a capacity for Israel to drink from the waters of this memory. And I believe that was decisive.
We're going to hold for a commercial break and we'll come back and talk to Abba Eban about what Russia's role was in 1948. Evidently very helpful to Israel. And it's now come a full cycle. Bibi Netanyahu, the new prime minister of Israel, has visited Russia yesterday on a state visit. The second one, Yitzhak Rabin, was the first. We'll be right back. We're back. We're speaking with Abba Eban, who really needs no introduction. If you've ever heard him speak, he's spellbinding, probably one of the best orators in the 20th century. And we have the pleasure of talking history with him now. I'll bring you back to 47. The Russians, the Soviet Union at that time, they were very helpful in recognizing Israel.
I would say the most unexpected result of our first encounter with Gromyko was astonishing. All of a sudden he stood up and he said revolutionary things. He said that the Jewish people have suffered in the war. They have deep roots in the history of Palestine. We cannot afford to ignore it, and we therefore suggest that Palestine be divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And that began a real honeymoon with the Soviet Union, which lasted for about 2.5 years. After 2.5 years, they decided that the Cold War was more important for them than relations with the United States. But during that period, there was nothing that they wouldn't offer us.
What caused that?
I think they made a very hard-headed decision themselves. I've already referred to the hard-headed decision on the British side, that the Jews had to be for them and that the Arabs didn't have to be. Now, there was a Russian argument which went like this. The important thing is the Cold War. The Israelis, with all respect, etc., cannot possibly join with us because they depend on America. They depend on American Jews. They depend upon American grants in aid. And according to their Marxist thinking, economics was the important thing. So they more or less gave up on Israel after a year or two. Why had they supported Israel before that? Because their calculation was this: who is more likely to get rid of the British from the Middle East than anybody else? And they reached the conclusion, which was quite a sensible and rational one, that the Israelis, who were then fighting hard against the permanence of British rule, were much more likely to get rid of the British. In the Russian view, the important thing was how to shake Russia free from this strangling embrace of British bases, because British bases for them meant American bases. They just thought of America as a country which had previously been Britain. Well, the Jews are much more likely because here are the Arabs. They've got a big position in the Suez Canal. They've got a position at the Habani airport in Iraq. They've got a position in Libya, in Cyrenaica. And the Jews are much more likely to get rid of the British than anybody else. And therefore, they went along with us for those 2 years. After those 2 years, when Britain no longer was the dominant power, they couldn't have cared less what happened to Israel.
I interviewed Bismarck, who was foreign minister for a time during Gorbachev's period. And I asked him some of these questions. And he agrees with you, but then he said Gorbachev sort of brought it around the second round, and Jim Baker, as he said, brought him around, and they wanted to get back into the Middle East, but that was at the waning days of the Soviet Union. I think it's the miracle of Israel, in a sense, that first of all, you got the Americans to come around, and then you got the Russians. Otherwise, where would you be? I mean, it was...
Well, that's true, because without a joint American-Russian policy, which in the days of the Cold War seemed a fantastic idea. I'll never forget when people like Mike Pearson, the Canadian leader, said he would get together with Gromyko and with the Americans. We thought that was just impossible. There were no other acts of cooperation at that time between the Soviet Union and the United States. But somehow this wedding ring of Israel brought them together triumphantly. And as you indicate, without that synthesis of Russia plus America, we wouldn't even have made the votes.
Very sore topic still in Israel, Al Talena. Ben-Gurion made this great decision to fire on a boat of the Irgun, which was carrying weapons in. Was that a correct decision?
It seemed to me to be an inevitable decision because at that time Israel was fighting very hard to establish its reputation as a sovereign state. Well, how can you be a sovereign state if you have two armies? If you don't have a monopoly of violence on one side, you can't really apply for statehood. And at that particular time, 1948 and 49, Ben-Gurion's passion, and he always had one passion which he would pursue to the end.
The army.
And the idea was the army and recognition by the powers. And he was not able to get recognition if he allowed a dissident army to operate. And although it was very, very cruel, and when one looks at the pictures now, I must say I've had that experience. And to see these Jews bearing arms and struggling in the water, it was a decision of great pathos. And Ben-Gurion, however, vindicated it on that issue, that Israel had to achieve and assert its sovereignty.
I asked Bar Zohar if he talked to Ben-Gurion about that, because he's his official biographer. He said yes, and he was never repentant. He thought it was correct, and he never felt badly about it. On the other hand, he said that Ben-Gurion never felt repentant about too much anyway.
That's right.
So it wasn't his calculations of...
David Ben-Gurion was not an introspective person. He was not always looking for defects in his own record.
You have met every political figure probably in the last half a century. If you had to collect 5 in this room, who would be the most interesting?
The most interesting and not always the most friendly.
Right.
The man who interested me to a degree of fascination was de Gaulle. And de Gaulle, half of the time he was our staunch ally, helping us to build our forces in every respect, even with some indication of a nuclear dimension. And all of a sudden, in 1967, he became very agitated. I met him then, May the 24th, 1967, and he was as cold as ice.
That was before the
just before the war. And he said, he shouted, "Ne faites pas la guerre, don't make war." And before I had time to sit down, anyway, don't be the first to make war. And then he said, "Il faut que les quatre se concertent." The 4 great powers should get together. From there I went right off to Washington, and President Johnson said to me, "What did de Gaulle say to you?" And I said, he said that the 4 great powers should get together. And President Johnson said, "Well, who the hell are the other 2? He didn't go along with the idea that there were 4 great powers.
How was Johnson? Did you find him interesting? He was a cowboy.
He had a certain sort of a fatherly attitude towards me during the very tense period of the 6-Day War. And he said very, very important things which illustrated his own impotence as a president. He said, "Look, if you don't get your people to work in the Congress, I'm nothing. I'm just a 6'4" Texan, and don't expect me to do anything. And now you get your friends in the embassy, you get them to move their anatomies all up on the hill and try and get them together, and then we can have a real armada and break through the Nazi blockade." He believed that for 5 or 6 days, and then he stopped believing that he could really push his way. And he said, "I had a bunch of rabbis here, and they said that I mustn't let a screwdriver go to Vietnam, but I should push the whole of the 7th Fleet right through the Straits of Aqaba." And I could see that he was tormenting himself because he had really lost power. And because he had lost power, he felt a sense of relief when Israel went ahead anyway. Because at that time, when Israel went ahead and did its work, when our Air Force, led by Weizmann and the Horde, destroyed the Egyptian army in a few hours, at that time he was visibly pleased, and I had a call from him from Washington, and he, first of all, he said, "You continue to talk on the television." He attached enormous importance to television. When I went to see him in the White House, he sat there, and he had 4 buttons, one of which said NBC, ABC, CBS, and PBS. And the 5th one, to my distress, said Fresca. Fresca was a sort of a grapefruit drink. And I had a terrible idea that he would one day press the wrong button. He would want Fresca, but he would blow up the world.
Another time when I met you was during the Yom Kippur War.
Right.
And there was Senator Hartke was very anxious to be helpful. And there was a big discussion about whether Henry Kissinger was holding back the arms to Israel or not. Do you have any recollection of
I have recollection. I also have a very strong view on the subject. A great injustice has been done to Henry Kissinger because the truth is that the decision was that of President Nixon, who was much more friendly to Israel than most Israelis want to admit.
Right.
And he had Kissinger on his side. The people who were not on his side were the Pentagon people who were thinking of oil the whole time.
Schlesinger?
Yes, I think the Secretary of Defense, also there was somebody else, the number 2, I forget his name, in that department. But Henry worked very, very hard to get the airlift going. And there's a lot of talk about the delay. There wasn't a delay. On Tuesday morning, we, that is I and Mr. Dinitz, the ambassador, were told to report to the State Department and to Nixon that we would end the war by the end of the week. And then everything went wrong on the Wednesday, when we lost 50 airplanes and 200 tanks. And then we started really scrambling to get some arms into the pipeline. The pipeline arrived in Israel too late to win the war, but the knowledge that there was a pipeline enabled our military leaders to be much less parsimonious with the way they disposed of our weaponry. And Nixon and Kissinger together should be given the credit for that.
That's good. You cleared up history. We're going to cut for a commercial break and come back and talk about the peace process. And I understand you're working on a film concerning it.
Sure.
I don't know how you're going to get an ending, but maybe you're a genius that we really don't know about, and all of us. We'll be right back. We're back. We're speaking with Abba Eban, the former foreign minister and deputy. I don't want to waste time because I want to get his wisdom, so I'm not even going to introduce him because he doesn't need an introduction. How important was Camp David?
Well, Camp David was the first stage in what became the peace process. And the peace process was the most dramatic and forward-looking event in Israeli diplomatic history. It was the first time that a Jewish leadership, at that time Rabin and Peres, decided on a totally new orientation. Israel had always been looking for assistance from outside the region. During the First World War, it was the British. And then during the 1947, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. And for a brief shining moment, it was France that gave us the weaponry and the Mirage, the aircraft, and our nuclear development. And then it was the United States. But here were Rabin and Peres deciding, why not see the Arab world as the arena for Israeli diplomacy? And within a few years, we had relations. We had a treaty with Egypt, we had a treaty with Jordan, we had diplomatic relations with Tunisia, we had diplomatic relations with Morocco, we had relations with Qatar, we had relations with Oman, we had relations with 15 Arab states. And we created the broadest breakthrough toward the Arab and Muslim world, because we also had the 15 republics, the Muslim republics of the Soviet Union, and we began to build a certain position, breaking the myth of Arab and Muslim hostility. And then it was arrested. We had an election and things changed. But it was a tremendous originality. And now we have the Oslo Agreement. And the Oslo Agreement is one of the most extraordinary documents in history. It is supported, of course, by those who supported it, but it's also supported by those who opposed it. And everybody in Israel has to stand up and salute when you say Oslo. And this after a period during which it was an axiom of politics that nothing important can ever happen in Norway. But it did happen in Norway. And the Oslo Agreement is the only basis on which you can even dream of some kind of Arab-Israeli consensus. And I think it's going to happen. I think that the fact that it's supported by its opponents is the biggest compliment you can give to any document.
Do you think that there is a de facto Palestinian state today? I mean, President Arafat comes here as a chairman.
There was a time when two articles appeared in the Jerusalem Post, one by Kissinger and one by myself, and both of us wrote, quite coincidentally, that Arab statehood is inevitable. And Henry went further. He said that if Arafat proclaims a state, it will be recognized by 160 nations. So that's a card they have up their sleeves. It's true in the sense that it was true that the state of Israel existed before it was recognized, because we already had the Histadrut, we had an army, we had a democracy, we had leadership, we had all the ingredients of statehood. Well, the PLO now has all the ingredients of statehood, and it's a matter of time when they decide to put that to the test. But when they do that, I think everybody all the Arab world will recognize them, including even Jordan and Egypt.
The first one to tell me this was Bruno Kreisky. When I visited with him, that was during the hostage crisis, 1978. He said a Palestinian state would be inevitable, and most Jews at that time didn't want to accept that thought. Yeah. Today, I think 50% of Jews can accept that thought.
Well, there's been a poll which says that 49% of Jews in Israel and in America believe that it is inevitable, and 70% believe that it's going to happen whether they like it or not.
You knew or know King Hussein since about 68, am I correct?
Quite right. I began my contacts with him. They were secret contacts because for me it wouldn't matter whether they were secret or not, but for him it would have mattered very much. For him it was a matter of life and death, not to let the thing leak out. And he and I used to meet in London, I think, on 7 or 8 occasions.
Is he sincere?
He's sincere in the following respects. He does not believe that Jordan can be the leader of the Arab world. And therefore it's no use saying, well, why didn't he push the Arab world forward? He's very modest about his own country. He believes that the center of Arab power are the great cities of the Baghdad and Damascus and Mecca, Medina, and so on. But he has been working for Israeli-Arab cooperation consistently since the 1967 war. That is still his passion. I think he attacked our own government with excessive vehemence the other day, but it matters to him very much.
Yeah, that letter that he sent to Bibi Netanyahu the other day, what's the meaning of that?
But he really was exasperated by 2 or 3 initiatives. He was exasperated by the tunnel incident because the tunnel was something that could be done or not done, but there was no reason to sacrifice 75 lives, including Palestinians and Israelis, for that. And then hardly had the ink dried on that when there came this proposal really to abolish any idea of any kind of part of Jerusalem being a center of Arab life and culture. And it is one of the centers, it is the most important city. That doesn't mean to say that they have to have a capital there, but they must have more position than they have had until now. And here were we going around building new areas which would have had the effect of enclosing the whole of the Arab population in a kind of a sort of a safety belt. And these things matter to him. Also, when he came here at a time when Jews and Arabs were killing each other, and President Clinton convened a big conference. And Clinton had received support from President Mubarak of Egypt, and also, of course, from Chairman Arafat. And when he did not get the expected cooperation from Prime Minister Netanyahu, he went off on a tangent and began to become very, very, very...
I can tell you
virulent.
that I met with some of Clinton's people over the weekend. They're very upset with Netanyahu. Now, perhaps today, unfortunately, this tragedy where these little girls were killed by this Jordanian soldier will ease the temperature a little bit, so to speak, for a few days. But basically, there is a lot of anger there. And
it's very hard to be consoled by something like the shooting of schoolgirls. I think it will create a kind of situation where King Hussein might feel that he might have done better if he had said what he had to say to Prime Minister Netanyahu.
privately.
But if he had said it a little less sharply.
Yeah, because Netanyahu can get the sympathy of the nation right now. I mean, everybody's in sympathy for these poor little girls.
Sure.
You're doing a film on the peace process.
Yeah.
How are you going to end this? How, where, what? Tell us. Do you have an ending?
Well, I've told my friends at the PBS, because they're going to produce the film, that I go around feeling a bit like Schubert with his unfinished symphony. But I really think that is going to be the answer, because if you look around the world in the Middle East, and you look at even at Saudi Arabia, but if you then look at Egypt and at Jordan and at the Palestinians, and even Syria, one thing they do not want war. There isn't one single nation there who feels that it could afford a war, especially war with a new weaponry, which is going to be much more catastrophic than the old weaponry. And opposition to war doesn't mean peace, of course, but it's a good halfway towards peace. And I find that political decisions are much more influenced by the absence of an alternative.
That's true.
And it's the absence of alternatives that counts. And there are no alternatives now to some kind of consensuality between the Israelis and Arabs.
Maybe you can help me. About 8 years ago, our friend Ezer Weitzman dispatched me to see Yasser Arafat in Tunis, which was not a very welcome feeling. He beats people 3 in the morning, and he's got 50 bodyguards around him. And Weitzman really wanted me to go to see if we could do business with him. That was the quote we had. And I went, and I told 3 people, Shimon Peres, Chaim Bar-Lev, Ezer Weitzman, and Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin was the defense minister. When I came back and reported to Rabin, he said to me, I don't want to hear about him. He's nothing. He recognizes nobody. He has no leadership, blah, 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 blah. 7 years later, I'm on the White House lawn, and he's shaking his hand. Sure. Can you tell me how he transformed?
I think he transformed...
No alternative? Is that you?
I believe that Rabin had a purely analytical approach. Neither he nor even Peres had cared anything about the Arabs all their lives. Right. It never occurred to them that they ought to find out what was written on the shops or what was said on the radio. Not a single element of contact. And yet, by a purely analytical process, they reached the conclusion that for the first time it was possible to make a breakthrough in the Arab world, not Britain as before, and not France, and not the United States even, or not alone, but the Arab world was, as it were, open for the first time. And they moved with swiftness into that. And they
go down in history as Nobel Prize. We're out of time. Would you believe it, Ambassador? It's been a pleasure. And we need to bring you back to get some more truth out of history. Although your friend Weitzman told me, as he reads history from day to day, he believes nothing. He doesn't even believe Caesar was short.
Right.
We'll see you next week. We can't beat this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.